Today, Games Workshop has shared some data from their biggest Warhammer 40k tournament. Let's talk about objectives going first and future updates, with a review of Games Workshop's Metawatch. Hello and welcome back to Warsbets Tactics, where today I thought we'd take a look at Games Workshop's Metawatch, and just a few of the most interesting details out of it, including a few statistics, a few hints as to balance updates, and the winning list of their big grand tournament that they shared. I think the Metawatch updates in Warhammer 40k are generally fairly good, generally keeping people informed about what sort of balance updates and things that might happen for 40k in the future, and also perhaps doing a little bit more to acknowledge when things aren't quite so well balanced, or when things need a fix in the game, compared with Games Workshop in the past, which often didn't really tend to say any of this whatsoever. It appears that this one was maybe a little bit less well received though, compared with a few of their others. They seem to have a slightly unhealthy like to dislike ratio on their YouTube video at least. I feel like perhaps in early 10th edition it is still clear that some armies are really having some teething troubles, and for at least a fair few people out there it's hard to play one of their main armies competitively. I suspect that people might have wanted a bit more acknowledgement of that. The update was focused a bit around the Warhammer 40k Tacoma Open tournament, which is the biggest one of 10th edition so far I believe, a 400 player tournament. And as normal with these, they did cover really quite a lot about 40k design ideas, and a fair amount of established ground that they've said before on that, but they did have some interesting new stuff. It was perhaps a little bit disappointing that they didn't come out with a great big percentage win chart like they often do to show the factions that are doing well or doing worse. I feel like they might well be saving that for a future update maybe. Perhaps one where they aren't focusing on a specific event. They did say that armies that are breaching their 55% win target are things like Genestealer Cult, Eldari and Knights. From at least other stats out there, it looks like Genestealer Cult and Eldari are probably the higher out of the two compared with the Knights, though they're all very strong of course. And for factions that are particularly struggling right now, they called out Blood Angels, Leagues of Votann, Admech and Death Guard. They're perhaps some of the ones that are having the most trouble, though there are quite a lot of other factions that have big issues beyond that. In the video though, they did give us a few interesting bits of data on certain 40k things that I found kind of interesting. First up, they talked about the 40k missions and fixed versus tactical objectives. In the mission deck, you can either just choose to play a few fixed ones or go for the more random tactical ones. Apparently the split of people playing it fixed versus tactical is around about 20% versus 80%, and that was at least at their competitive tournament. I wouldn't be too surprised perhaps if people playing a bit more casually perhaps just go tactical for simplicity. Kind of interesting to hear the numbers, and apparently for people going either fixed or tactical, the win rates of them were around about 50-50. I guess that kind of makes sense. If good players are playing at least fairly optimally, you'd hope that people playing sensibly would just choose the objective that made most sense for them and gave them the easiest path to victory. Just anecdotally, it seems like tactical objectives do generally seem to be overall the most powerful, and a lot of people build their list specifically for that, with things like random units running around and deep striking all over the place. Quite good for doing the ones where you need to be in the corners or the enemy's deployment zone. In particular, a few deep strikers can make that quite a lot easier. Perhaps some of the better fixed ones often tend to be the ones for killing things a bit more, maybe bringing it down against, say, a big vehicle army, for example, and then hoovering up a few more points with something else. Seems good though that neither one nor the other is completely dominant. I feel like quite a lot of people are happy to play the tactical ones after 9th edition and the bookkeeping of the secondaries that they had there. As well as that, they also mentioned some stats for the Gambits, used by around about 5% of players at that event apparently, and supposedly out of the people who took Gambits, around about 7% of them were successful, basically pulling off that desperate ploy where you try and get an extra 30 victory points, though when you do so you sacrifice the primary objective completely, so it doesn't usually make sense to do unless you've either scored all your primary points or you're mathematically behind to the extent where you can't possibly catch up. Seems like as a mechanic that looks like it's working okay for them. Most of the time, if you're playing to win or maximise your score, they're probably not going to be the best idea, but they are kind of nice that they exist as something that can entertain you for the later stage of the game, even if in reality they don't often score you all that much. Kind of a shame that I don't think they mentioned any stats as to how many Gambit objectives they actually flip from a loss to a win. I'd guess that will be far less than the 7% that actually achieve the Gambits. Even if you score 30 points, you might well still be very behind in terms of primaries and secondaries, to the extent where 30 points might not make the swing enough, as you probably wouldn't take one unless you're desperate. Otherwise, they mentioned that they seem to have kept the first turn win rate in a pretty good place at the moment, this being the win rate of the armies that go first versus the armies that go second. Always quite a big role that can determine the whole flow of the game at the very start of it, but ideally you don't want it to be too big a factor in who wins and who loses, and not have the game basically come down to a coin flip. This had been a real issue for 40k in the past, seeing as one army gets to move, shoot and axe before the other army, but in 9th edition they'd solved it at least fairly well. Good line of sight blocking terrain and features with progressive scoring and then giving an advantage to the going second player on the last turn did seem to be enough to make it pretty even, and it looks like it hasn't changed significantly in 10th apparently. I'd guess that terrain might be a fairly big factor in that. If you played 40k casually with very sparse terrain and some gunline units, I strongly suspect that the swing will be far worse, but it seems at least with these tournament missions with their preset terrain and everything, they're not doing too badly for this metric. Next up, there are a few hints about future balance updates, and some hints for the stronger armies out there at the moment. Apparently the next balance pass will be in September, so around about 5 to 7 weeks away, according to the video. I'm not sure if they mentioned September before, I know they'd said autumn at least in the past. For the armies that are struggling a bit, I guess that's not all that long to wait, but hopefully when it comes around, the armies that are struggling get helped enough. There've certainly been a few in the past where Games Workshop's been so light touch that almost nothing has changed. Even though I appreciate that they probably don't want to hit things so hard that they take an army from being really weak to the most overpowered thing in the game. So it does require a bit of a balancing act. For the armies that they specifically called out as being strong, the main names that were mentioned were Genestealer Cults, Eldari and Imperial Knights. Genestealer Cults I think have a good argument to be perhaps the single strongest army in the game at the moment. A very similar win rate to Eldari, but they seem to come out quite well in that individual matchup against the Eldar. They said that they've been doing very well in events, but generally not dominating things due to not really all that many people collecting the faction. Broadly, when they were discussing them, they said that they liked the feel of the rules, the way that the army is basically an unending horde, and repeatedly pressing on the enemy army to try and do enough damage before they're wiped out again. And that might imply that they just keep with the same rules for them, but charge more points as the premium for the neophytes or the acolytes respawning repeatedly. The acolytes in specific sound like they're almost certainly going to incur a nerf. They called out demo charges as being a bit too efficient, which I would agree with the crazy amount of damage that they can put out when they deep strike in close. Otherwise for Eldari, they said that they were broadly happy with the change that they made to Fate Dice and the points changes, and in the tournament there was a bit less spam of devastating wounds and Wraith Knights than there probably otherwise would have been, but they still have a bit too much speed and firepower, perhaps to put it lightly. I think I'd agree that their points changes have had an impact on them, but perhaps only bringing them down to be the joint best faction in the game as opposed to the outright best perhaps. They still seem absolutely stand out compared with most of the pack, and I wouldn't be too surprised if a few choice units did suffer a few more nerfs. Otherwise, they just generally mentioned that Knights were fairly strong, though didn't really call out anything too much in specific, didn't talk any more about towering for example, and they also mentioned Custodes who won the event, though they made the statement that they wouldn't have generally considered them perhaps one of the top 3 armies in the game, though at least by win rates and things it looks like them and Thousand Sons are perhaps following up these top 3. Otherwise for updates, the next one that we're going to expect is the Errata update for the index cards. No firm date for this yet, but they said in the next week or so. I'd probably guess next week for that. Their previous time frame was in July for that, so it sounds like they're going to have a good go at fixing the big list of errors that have become apparent in the indexes. They do have really quite a lot of big FAQs to make for this. I think most people are expecting them to rule one way or the other. Things like maybe the amount of med packs that Krieg have, the Leagues of Votan appraising Glare thing, which doesn't work rules as written right now. A few things that are maybe just a little bit odd and questionably intentional, things like Toughness 5 Gretchen or scoring Spore Mines for the Tyranids, and the big Imperial Knight rerolls that looks like they might be just single rerolls of just 1 hit of 1 and 1 wound of 1, at least if we're going by the ruling of their Tacoma Open event. There's absolutely tons more as well. I'd expect that to be a pretty hefty FAQ document when it comes out. Finally, they also mentioned the Adeptus Custodes list that won the Tacoma Open. Beating all comers in an 8-round win streak, the event was won by Steve Trimble and his Custodian Guard. I would definitely agree that I wouldn't have guessed the Custodes to win the single biggest event for Warhammer 40k so far. Certainly very powerful and a real challenge for some armies to deal with, particularly with all of the reactive melee with Fight First, but there is quite a lot of other scary stuff out there. I guess some terrain setups can really favour Custodes quite a bit. Not sure if that might have been the case here to some extent. Apparently it was Custodes versus Custodes in the final. Whatever the terrain or missions though, this one does look absolutely enormously intimidating. 3 enormous blocks of 10 Custodian Guard with 8 spears and a couple of shields plus a Vexilla. 2 of them headed up by standard shield captains for 3 stratagems, one with Ceaseless Hunter, and the other with Trajan Valoris himself and his awesome melee might with his Moment Shackle. Having all that golden armour coming straight at you and just standing on the midfield objectives and laughing off all comers is going to be pretty massively scary. I can get really quite a lot tougher with the -1 damage stratagem, restore the old Custodian with the healing stratagem, and be good with the fight's first stratagem as well if they get charged. Getting through those units is really quite a slog with just how easy it is to get cover saves in 40k these days, and particularly with a fair few anti-tank weapons getting a bit worse AP than they had before. Then beyond that, there's just a whole load of things to score points: a cheap 10 wound Sister of Silence Prosecutor squad with the bolters, a Calidus assassin that can nuke one enemy stratagem plus jump on and off the board to jump around doing objectives, potentially assassinating a character fairly efficiently with the Neural Shredder and the Phase Sword. And then there's 2 copies of the very popular Exaction squads, just 35 points for a small 5-man unit of Arbites. These guys are just pretty excellent, low investment, tough units with a 5+ Feel No Pain and a 4+ Carapace armor save. Seems like just the sort of unit that you'd like to have hiding around the map and doing things like tactical objectives, or perhaps holding down the odd point that your custodian block needs to move on from. Overall looks very, very scary. I'm sure this many golden boys would just stat check a fair few armies that just don't have enough firepower to deal with this sheer amount of tough armor saves. In any case, even with a scary list, a massive achievement to win such a big event, the biggest tournament of 10th edition so far. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed a quick roundup of Games Workshop's latest update. Let me know what you think about their mission stats. Overall seems like fairly good news to me. What are your hopes and fears for their Errata and balance updates? And let me know what you think of the list that won the Tacoma Open. As always, I look forward to hearing your insights and ideas down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and if you'd like to support these kind of videos and keep them coming, any support on there is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages: seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.